ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this training on cannabis medicines. Now, this training is designed specifically for healthcare professionals, but is suitable for all levels of knowledge, no matter your qualifications or background. Now, in this presentation, we're going to try and give you as much information as we can to help you make smarter cannabis decisions. Now, that includes being able to communicate more clearly around cannabis products, being able to support patients with harm-reducing decisions, so limiting the risks to them and making smart decisions, helping you as well understand the pros and cons of cannabis products and some of the risks that they potentially pose, the medical applications of cannabinoids and their potential in medicine, and also the current state of research and the future directions that this is pointing in. So for those who don't know me, my name's Christopher Tasker, and I'm a consultant in cannabis science within the cannabis industry. And so my background is actually in medical research, looking at how cannabinoids in the endocannabinoid system can be used to develop potential treatments for inflammation disorders, cancer, and primarily gut disorders, which is my focus. Since then, I've developed a company called Global Cannabinoid Solutions, where we help businesses, investors, and decision makers apply and understand all of this cannabis science, what it means for their business, what it means for the public, for healthcare professionals, and translate all of this cannabinoid science and research into useful resources and tools. In this training, what we're going to do is give you as much information from that 10 years of experience I've got and give you a quick run through of all the latest cannabis science, where we're up to, and everything that you need to know as a healthcare professional. So cannabis is an ancient medicine, essentially, that we humans have used for millennia. Now, as far as the British goes and as far as Great Britain goes, our earliest documentation of cannabis was around the 1500s, when hemp textiles and cannabis sativa was actually being grown and utilized for its textile properties and industrial uses. So at the time, that primarily meant sails and ropes and everything required for sailing resources. From there, in the later 1800s, William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, an Irish physician, came across cannabis essentially whilst he was working in India and documented a lot of the uses of cannabis by the Indian culture at the time and brought back that learning and wrote about it in the medical curriculum in the UK. And so between the 1800s and 1940s, cannabis was pretty well used and deployed within the medical infrastructure. There were tinctures, and these were being prescribed and used by patients around the world. In the 1960s, however, there was a push to start to control drug use, as there was a prevailing increase in drug addiction, opiate addiction, and the UN convened to develop a single convention on narcotics, which regulated and dictated a new set of controls around how narcotic drugs such as opiates and cannabinoids would actually be regulated, who would be allowed to cultivate those, what the laws were around public consumption and possession. And that led to the prohibition of cannabis in the UK and internationally. And in 1971, the UK developed the Misuse of Drugs Act, which essentially led to our most recent prohibition of cannabis. And that's really what's held out until today, which has resulted in thousands, if not millions, of incarcerated people around the world. And so bringing us up to today, in the early 2000s, the medical potential of cannabis was rediscovered. And that's when we started to see the first cannabinoid pharmaceutical organizations developing and creating novel cannabis-based medical products. And so that's sort of where we're up to today. We're now in a phase where the medical applications of cannabinoids are being increasingly brought to the attention of the public. They're receiving greater recognition internationally, and that ultimately led to a change in the law in the UK in 2018. Now, this came about as a result of an increasing wave of patients with epilepsy who were seeing incredible changes in their ability to be able to manage their severity of symptoms when it came to seizures. So as an example, a study was put together to demonstrate and highlight the incredible benefits that cannabinoid medicines had in this specific group. Now, this was a fairly small cohort size, but as you can see, the seizure severity of some of the patients was into thousands of seizures per month. So you can imagine just how intense the struggle might be for patients and family members suffering that frequency of seizures. And what they found was that these cannabis medicines were able to reduce seizure frequency by up to 86%, which is unheard of in terms of anti-seizure medications and anti-epileptic drugs. But this came with a severe drawback, which was that the financial costs of these drugs were incredibly high, and that has meant that numerous patients whose lives have been saved and could be saved by cannabis medicines are experiencing incredible financial costs, which can be into the thousands of pounds a month for these life-saving medicines. The results of this study highlighted a landmark need for a drastic change in our cannabis policy, and so this was the underpinning reason for this law change and the incredible, inspiring stories of patients and families and the transformation that these cannabis medicines had given them. So cannabis products come in many forms. Now, typically, most people have seen the cannabis plant and are familiar with the buds or the flowers of cannabis. Many people are unaware just how many products can be created for cannabis plant. And so this includes oils, capsules, vaporizers, creams, cosmetics. And so really, the ingredients of cannabis have numerous applications. And many people do get focused on the actual drug plant itself and the number of challenges that come with that. The active components within cannabis can be transformed into a number of different products, which you see everywhere across shelves in the retail space, but then also in the medical space. So let's take a quick look at what's inside cannabis and what it means for you. So this is just like any other plant. It contains all of the typical plant compounds, such as the waxes, cellulose, chlorophyll, and the pigments that come with a green plant. But within cannabis are some special therapeutic compounds that have a vast array of effects within the body. So primarily we're talking about phytocannabinoids, which are a group of over 120 different drug-like compounds or chemical compounds that are found within the cannabis plant. So in addition to the phytocannabinoids are flavonoids and terpenes. Now these give cannabis its unique smell and flavor, and in combination, there is over 500 different compounds and active therapeutic compounds within cannabis. So that includes all of the phytocannabinoids, all of the flavonoids, and all of the terpenes. Every cannabis plant has a unique combination of these therapeutic compounds. These will be found in different ratios. And so that makes every cannabis plant very unique in terms of its potential effects. Now, although we hear a lot of negative things about cannabis and how dangerous it is, the actual lethal dose of cannabis is incredibly high. When this has been tested in animals, they found the lethal dose to be anywhere from 3,000 to 9,000 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. And so this is oral doses of pure cannabinoids ingested by these animals, and the lethal doses were exceptionally high and almost impossible to achieve in humans without eating significant quantities of cannabis. So cannabis is this complex chemical soup of compounds that each have their own unique effects. And so the challenge therein lies, how do we get the compounds and unique cocktail of chemicals that is therapeutic and useful to the individual? Now, although cannabis is incredibly safe and these compounds are not particularly toxic in terms of lethality, there are a number of risks and challenges that we need to be aware of. So how do we get cannabis compounds and these phytocannabinoids, terpenes, and flavonoids into the body? The problem with cannabinoids and phytocannabinoid medicines overall is that they are very hard for the body to absorb. And so we do need to explore a number of different carrier methods or ways of how these cannabinoids get into the bloodstream. Now, firstly, we have inhalation, which is one of the more commonly encountered and more traditional ways of consuming cannabinoids. Many people typically have smoked cannabis historically. Now, it does have the benefit of it being very fast acting. However, in that cannabis smoke, there are a number of toxic compounds as well. And so patients that are consuming cannabis and then smoking it are actually holding back and almost nullifying many of the therapeutic effects received from the cannabis compounds within that smoke. Preferably, patients that are inhaling their cannabinoid medicines are using a vaporizer, which doesn't combust the cannabis, but means that the cannabis is heated to just a high enough temperature, approximately 200 degrees Celsius, so that the oils and phytocannabinoids within cannabis begin to vaporize and those can be inhaled into the lungs. Oral consumption is also incredibly popular. However, the struggle with oral consumption is that it can be slow, and then also the bioavailability of cannabinoids administered orally is very limited, approximately 6 to 13%, depending on the method or the product that's being consumed. Now, again, it can be a lot simpler for people who aren't comfortable inhaling products, but again, it does have its drawbacks, and sometimes those patients maybe need to use more cannabinoids just so that they can actually absorb a portion of that 10% that is entering the body. And then secondly, there can be a bit of an onset delay when it comes to the effects of those products. So this is where we see a number of people potentially overdosing because they're double dosing themselves and not waiting long enough for those cannabinoids to absorb through their digestive system. Finally, transdermal applications are also effective. Depending on the product, there's a pretty broad range of products out there and different systems and compounds that are used to aid the uptake of cannabinoids into the skin. Patches are becoming increasingly popular, but also topicals have seen great success when it comes to, say, arthritic conditions where it just needs to enter the skin and directly apply that to the body. And the benefit of transdermal patches and creams and balms is that it reduces a lot of those off-site effects as well. And it means that we're not applying cannabinoids systemically to the whole body, and we can focus that maybe on the extremities, knees, joints, or the specific area that we're trying to target. And so there's a bit of flexibility that needs to be factored in when it comes to which is the best method for each consumer or patient. And this is something that is, again, being refined, and a lot of the data is quite unique and new, as majority of data is still in animal models and in cell models. And so our challenge now is applying this to humans and figuring out exact bioavailability rates and what are the optimal methods of delivery for each patient and for the different conditions that patients have. So there are a couple of dangers out there as well relating to cannabinoids. Now, because of the increasing interest and conversation around cannabis, it's getting a lot more publicity. There are also very dangerous products that find their way into the cannabis supply chain, primarily when it comes to self-reliant patients who are sourcing products illicitly or buying cannabis from potentially unvetted sources. And so there is an issue with synthetic cannabinoids, which are a far more potent synthetic version of naturally occurring THC. Now, the danger with these products is that they're odorless, they're untested, and they can be developed and synthesized very quickly. And before we can ban them and make them illegal, chemists have created brand new combinations of artificially designed synthetic cannabinoids which target the same areas in your body as cannabis does. Danger of these products is that they closely resemble cannabis products. These ingredients might find their way into gummies, for example, at events. They might be handed out. And so because they are so potent, they can also have incredibly dangerous effects on the human body. And there have been deaths reported as a result of synthetic cannabinoids being ingested either accidentally or intentionally. And so, but this is what's primarily underpinning the spice epidemic and a lot of the issues that come with synthetic cannabis that is still available for purchase over the counter, unfortunately, and online. And so this is something to be aware of in the clinical setting and also with patients who are potentially sourcing these products themselves from friends, colleagues, or even the black market. So in total, there are 3 key cannabinoid families to be aware of. There are the phytocannabinoids in cannabis, which are derived from the plant. There are synthetic cannabinoids, which are engineered pharmaceutically, created in the lab, and engineered chemically. And then thirdly, we have endocannabinoids, which are compounds very similar to the compounds found in cannabis that our body produces naturally. And these endocannabinoids are fundamental to human health across a number of different areas. And we're going to walk you through the importance of this endocannabinoid system as part of the cannabis conversation. And so this is really the physiology and biology of humans, which underpins the entirety of cannabis medicine. And this is really the most unexplored and unknown element of this entire cannabis medical debate. So the endocannabinoid system has been found in all tissues, organs, and bodily fluids thus far investigated. So wherever we've looked in the human body, there are elements of the endocannabinoid system, everywhere from the urinary tract through to the bone marrow of humans. So this system is found in all vertebrate animals and invertebrates, and is something that seems to have developed millions of years ago, very early on in cellular biology and cellular development. And so this system is found in most animals, most creatures on this earth, and is something that seems to be universal to life. And so the very ancient cellular signaling system that has really gone unacknowledged and unutilized when it comes to medicine in the West and overall modern pharmaceutical drug development. So what is the endocannabinoid system? Well, it is made up of 3 key components. So those firstly are the endocannabinoids, which are the compounds that are shared as messages between cells to communicate. There's the enzymes that create and destroy the endocannabinoids, and this is what allows the endocannabinoid ratios to be changed in the body in order to be able to maintain homeostasis and balance out the unique requirements of the body at that time. You've then got the receptors, which is what the endocannabinoids bind to create their effect on the cells and their commands and communicate with the body. And so this ratio of endocannabinoids, the enzymes that create and degrade the endocannabinoids, and the number of receptors that each cell is exhibiting on its surface for communication, this is all influenced and changing daily. It varies depending on our age, our weight, our gender, our health. And a lot of these elements are detected in diseases, and you will find variations in the endocannabinoid system in a whole host of different conditions, which gives us a very exciting target for potential therapies and for potential cannabis treatments that target this endocannabinoid system. So to continue on with our epilepsy theme, in this example, you can see how the endocannabinoid system is altered in temporal lobe epilepsy and how control tissue differs from sclerotic tissue or damaged tissue. So we can see that there's a downregulation in the CB1 receptor. There's less receptors for endocannabinoids to bind to. You can also see that 2-AG, one of the primary endocannabinoids in the body, is reduced in its expression. There's lower levels of it. And then also DGL, which is the main enzyme responsible for the production of 2-AG, the endocannabinoid. And so that reduction in the expression of CB1, 2-AG, and DGL are all indicators of something being out of balance. Comes to the hippocampus of patients with epilepsy. Now, interestingly, there was no change in AEA, which is anandamide. And so as we go about analyzing diseases and looking at endocannabinoid elements within each condition, we can start to build up a picture of what exactly is faulty in the endocannabinoid system of these patients, and then we can potentially design treatments that target those elements of the endocannabinoid system. So in this case, you can see that the neuroprotective machinery involving the endocannabinoid system that protects the brain and its smooth function is impaired in the epileptic human hippocampus. And so this isn't just epilepsy, this goes for different cancers, this goes for arthritis, and there's a whole host of different diseases that we can look at and assess and measure now as a result of this endocannabinoid system endpoint that we can measure and target within the body. So currently, medical research into phytocannabinoids is still very much in its early basic phases. The majority of research is in animal studies, cell studies, and also epidemiological research in terms of trend analysis, different cohorts, and looking at what's going on in the population at large. A lot of the medical research focus and funding is around clinical trials and more specifically getting drugs and potential formulations through that clinical research process so that they can be licensed for international prescribing and, for example, utilized and prescribed through the NHS. Now, there are many types of research that give us great data. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to focus on producing specific drugs and licensing specific drugs, but the endocannabinoid system gives us a lot of uncharted territory that we can start to explore to create better medicines that target those specific areas of the body, and then giving us the best possible chance of creating useful, viable, clinically approved, licensed cannabis-based medicines. And the main problems with cannabis research is its reproducibility. By that I mean, there are a number of different clinical models that are used to test a number of different phytocannabinoid compounds, terpenes, and flavonoids. So standardizing that research and that knowledge can be incredibly difficult. And so at the moment, biggest struggle translating this in vitro and in vivo research from animals and cells into human studies and into viable, useful human data. And so that's really the next phase of development in this field, and there's still a very long way to go when it comes to the wider access and availability of licensed cannabis medicines. Currently, we only have a very small number of compounds and drugs that are licensed for patient use. So what does this mean for the current state of access for cannabis products and their many varieties? So first of all, there's three major pathways for access for cannabis products and the variety of compounds within those. So first of all, we have CBD products, which are available online. You can buy them on the high street over the counter. And these products are overseen by the Food Standards Agency. And so these products are meant to contain zero THC. In reality, there have been cases where THC has been detected in some of these products. So there is a high degree of variability and a lot of challenges that come with standardizing those over-the-counter wellness products and CBD products. So that's the first option for access. There's also an unofficial access pathway that a large number of the population use, which is the self-reliant sector, as it's called. And this constitutes patients that are perhaps growing cannabis themselves, or they're relying on the black market or friends to source some of their cannabis products and THC materials, which are unprescribed and tested, but sourced locally for the most part with the confidence of patients. Oftentimes as well, there are unsuspecting patients that are sourcing from the black market, and those risks that we mentioned before do need to be considered in those cases. Currently, private medical clinic able to prescribe GMP grade cannabis, which contains THC. Now, the caveat to these private clinics is that patients must have one of a series of qualifying conditions that cannabis can be prescribed for. These prescriptions are written by specialist consultants in their field, and these products do contain THC in varying levels, but are medically prescribed, and currently there are tens of thousands of patients consuming these medicines. This isn't just limited to cannabis flower. There are also tinctures and other THC containing consumable products such as gels, gummies, and other consumable items too. Finally, we have the few limited licensed NHS medicines that are currently prescribed by the NHS and accessible for the public. These medicines are really used as the last line of defense for patients who have gone through the full sort of chemical cocktail of potential prescription treatments. And this is very much used as the last line of defense. And so these medicines are very specific use cases and are quite difficult for patients to access. Now, although they do contain CBD and THC, some of these licensed medicines, they are not suitable for all patients, and unfortunately not all patients derive benefit from those medicines. And so you do see a lot of patients and family members who see some of the more crudely produced cannabis products are actually more effective for them than some of these highly refined licensed medications. So there is something to be said for the whole plant effect of cannabis as well for certain conditions. So I touched on there briefly, there are a number of challenges to prescribing these medicines, both for patients and for clinicians. So in a lovely study recently published, they interviewed 24 patients that are receiving cannabis prescriptions, whether it be flower that is vaporized or THC containing tinctures. All of those patients reported some degree of improvement in their symptoms and overall quality of life, and many of them were able to reduce the reliance on conventional medicines and medications that they were taking, which is a trend we see quite commonly across the world in different areas of research with regards to cannabis and reducing down prescription reliance. Fortunately, most people who are in the UK that could benefit from these prescriptions and these medicines do not currently access one. That's either due to stigma, or they're feeling uncomfortable, or they're not even aware that this is an option. And finally, as well, there is a significant financial burden that can potentially come with these, depending on how much cannabinoid content you actually require for your symptoms and manage your condition. Now, a large reason for this hesitance around medical cannabis is primarily due to the stigmatization that still exists around crude cannabis consumption and cannabis flowers as a therapeutic. There is a long history of prohibition and very strict prosecution when it comes to cannabis as well. And so there is a lot of hesitancy, but also a lot of stigma that is still directed towards patients who do have legitimate cannabis prescriptions and legitimate medical needs. And so this creates a bit of a conflict and a lot of discomfort, and in some cases discrimination around patients that are using their prescriptions and following the rules and following the guidance that's been given to them by clinicians. But unfortunately, there is still an environment in the UK where general cannabis consumption and possession is highly criminalized. And so it's difficult for these patients within that small bubble who are receiving these private prescriptions to be acknowledged and also sort of assimilate and find ways to responsibly use their prescriptions and feel comfortable, like, where do I vaporize my cannabis? What do I do if I'm on the train or traveling or at the hospital? And so there's a lot of downstream problems and questions that need to be answered and solved as we expand the uptake and access for these treatments. There are a number of things that we can do to actually influence the endocannabinoid system and have somewhat therapeutic effects on the body without actually having to integrate cannabis into the human and patient themselves. So primarily what we see is that there is a large indication that lifestyle significantly impacts your health, but also your endocannabinoid system. And so there are instances where we've seen the endocannabinoid system has been measured in different styles, such as the diet of the individual, the nutrients that they're putting into their body, the amount of sleep that they're getting, all goes into the regulatory balance of your endocannabinoid system. And again, obviously your body as a whole trying to survive and maintain and flourish with poor nutrients and with poor sleep. Alcohol and drugs also have a negative impact on the endocannabinoid system, which we can measure. And some of the combinations of alcohol with cannabis and other drugs can exacerbate some of the adverse effects that are experienced or reported around cannabis consumption and use. And so diet, sleep, and overall general health and well-being and lifestyle have a massive impact on your endocannabinoid system, but also at a clinical level, if we're overlooking those factors and just trying to prescribe a patient cannabis products, or they're just trying to use cannabis products and not changing or looking at some of those other lifestyle factors, we're missing out on large pieces of the puzzle and not really getting a full picture of what's going on with that patient and how we can get them to the best possible health state. So as a bit of a summary, we've got a nice little overview slide here of the two fundamentals as we see them, which are cannabis and the human. Firstly, on the cannabis side, the crop itself is highly variable. Most cannabis plants and every cannabis interaction is more or less unique. There are unique combinations of compounds, ratios, of terpenes, and all of those have little unique changes and effects on the results that you experience either as a patient or on the symptoms that you're trying to target. As well as that, a lot of cannabis products at the moment are unregulated, although there are very clear and outlined now access pathways for cannabis products. a lot of the public still do source these quite irresponsibly, and as well as that, the market is very difficult to regulate at the moment, especially if we're talking about online products. So that's something that we need to be aware of, in that not all cannabis products are the same, highly variable. The content can be massively different from what's reported on the label. So the doses can be very different from what's reported. The potency can be quite unexpected in some cases. And then the contamination of those products with heavy metals and with toxins potentially that have accumulated in the cannabis plant also find their way into the cannabis products. And so that's something that we need to be very careful with and aware of. And particularly if we're combining this with other prescription medications too. So the drug-drug interactions are quite significant. There are a lot of shared similarities in the first pass metabolism of prescription drugs and cannabis, i.e. the cytochrome enzymes in the liver. And so this is really one variable group of dynamics in the cannabis discussion. And then on the human side, there's a number of factors that we can control as well that relate to the overall success and health of the individual, where they're sourcing the cannabis from or their products from, how they're consuming those products can be incredibly telling and have massive effects on their body, their health, and the results that they receive. Mixing cannabis with other drugs can also have sort of downstream unwanted effects too, which obviously can either nudge us in a positive or negative direction, but that's another risk factor that is something that we can control, that humans are responsible for, and it's happening to the body. Risk awareness around some of those factors too. A lot of the issues that we see and that we hear around cannabis can be nullified just by making people aware of those risks, whether it be contamination, synthetic cannabinoids, or potentially leaving these drugs around and kids accidentally getting their hands on them. So if we're smart and we put out more educational information like this, the presentations that are patient facing, there's a lot of positive impact that we can have. And finally, everyone's body responds very uniquely to cannabis products, and obviously every cannabis product is unique in itself. So we've got two highly variable, highly adaptable groups of variables to try and manage and reduce the risks around, and try and dial that into a more precise therapeutic targeting of specific tissues, specific diseases, and specific conditions as well. So there's a lot of work to be done. CBD is very much just the tip of the iceberg, and the endocannabinoid system is that hidden treasure, more or less, in terms of medical research potential and ways that we can start reanalyzing diseases, reimagining them, and retargeting those conditions with cannabinoid-based therapies. So if you've enjoyed this presentation, we have a whole host of different resources, tools, trainings, ebooks, guides, videos that you can tuck into in our website, cannabissciencetraining.com. The whole purpose of our organization is to work with researchers on translating all of this information and useful science and clinical data into information that can be used in the boardroom, that can be used in the clinic, and all be there as part of a informed consent, smarter decision-making framework. And so this is digital. You can access it anywhere, anytime. And we have a whole bunch of free resources there for medical professionals and businesses. We do also have a community. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest cannabis science insights and all the latest scientific cannabis intelligence, join in our community, just make a little account, create a password, and you can log in and network and connect with all the thought leaders in the cannabis space, ask us questions, connect with experts, and access all of our lovely educational resources. So I want to say a big thank you for listening. Thank you for all the hard work you do for the NHS and for the patients of Britain. Thank you from myself and the Global Cannabinoid Solutions team.